The first step you need to accomplish when you remove the stock parts is to remove the hook from the winch. To remove the hook, you have to pull the cotter pin from the mounting pin. I like to use side cutters for pulling cotter pins because you can get a good bite on the cotter pin and also use the curve of the jaws as a lever to work the cotter pin out. Once you have the hook removed, pull the cable free, and then next remove the winch fair lead. The bolts are an 8mm Allen key, and the nuts on the back side take a 15mm wrench. With the fair lead removed, you'll need to remove the following stock components: the A-arm skid plates, the stock center skid plate, and the stock trailing arm skid plates. The stock front skid plate, or the bash plate, will be reused and will therefore remain in place. This picture shows all the fasteners you need to remove to get the stock skid plates off. They are as follows. A is the front skid plate bolts, which are T40 Torx with 13mm wrench for the nuts on the back side. B are the front A-arm bolts, T30 Torx with 10mm wrench for the nuts on the back side. C, the center skid plate bolts. You need a 10mm socket and a 10mm wrench for the nuts on the back side. D are the footwell bolts. You need a 10mm socket. E are the rear trailing arm skid plate bolts, T30 Torx with a 10mm wrench for the nuts on the back. And F is the rear trailing arm skid plate bolts, T30 Torx, again with a 10mm wrench for the nuts on the back side. Start by removing the front A-arm bolts. This is the right side. And also remove the left side. Move on to removing the front or the bash plate skid plate bolts with a T40 Torx and a 13mm wrench for the nuts on the back side. Next, remove the center skid plate bolts. Use a 10mm socket for the bolt heads and a 10mm wrench for the nuts on the back side. There are 6 in total you need to remove, as shown by the red arrows in this picture. I used a 1/4-inch drive ratchet with extension and a 10mm socket on the bolt heads, and of course a 10mm combination wrench on the back side for the nuts. This picture shows the 6 bolts removed from the center skid plate. With the bolts removed, you have to work the factory center skid plate out from between the frame and the factory metal bash plate. It can be quite tight. You may have to work it back and forth to lever it out. You may even have to pry a little bit to get it out, get it loose, but it will come out. Next, move on to removing the first 4 rear trailing arm skid plate bolts. There are 2 on each side, as shown by the red arrows. There are T30 Torx for the bolt head and a 10mm wrench for the nuts on the back side. With those removed, the last 2 rear trailing arm skid plate bolts, there's 1 per side, again T30 Torx and 10mm nut, are a little less obvious. The nut is accessible from inside the wheel, as shown in this picture at the red arrow, and the T30 Torx bolt can be reached through the wheel. I used a 1/4-inch drive ratchet with a long extension to reach the bolt head. With those removed, you finally have to also remove the 2 footwell bolts per side, for 4 total, using a 10mm socket. The positions of the bolts you need to remove are indicated here by the red arrows, and from the top view of the footwells, again, you can see here with the red arrows showing the bolts that need to be removed. This is the left side. This picture shows a close-up of the left side footwell bolt locations, obviously seen from underneath. Once you've removed the bolts, these holes will be reused when the Iron Baltic footwell skid plates are installed later. Once you've done all that, with all the stock skid plates removed, this is what you are left with, and we can move on to the next step.